Okay, good morning, everyone. We're almost at the halfway point. We're almost at the break point. And we're at the final day for myself, Morten, and Toby, which is very sad. But it's really exciting to see a friendly face added to the crowd. Adham Sauli. Adham, given that we're just loading up my PowerPoint, do you want to introduce yourself to people?
Sure. I'm Adham Sauli, currently Associate Professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and Senior Lecturer at University of St. Andrews. And I do international relations and Middle East politics. And I'll be presenting a paper on sectarianism and regime formation and deformation in Iraq and Lebanon. And I'll be discussing a few papers, around 4 exciting ones. So good to meet you all. Thanks.
Thanks, Adham. You modestly didn't mention your wonderful books. You've just recently had a book on Hezbollah published, which is fascinating, really, really interesting, offers a new and innovative way of exploring Hezbollah. But I guess you've reached the end of your desire to talk about Hezbollah now, have you? Yeah. Okay, so while we are just trying to solve a technical problem, I guess I will talk a little bit about my presentation for today. I want to start by thanking everyone at the Arab Center and Dana, everyone at the Institute, and all the wonderful team of people who are keeping us on time, keeping us on track, and helping facilitate everything. Thank you, all of you. I've learned a great deal from your presentations, from your talks, and it's been a week that's provoked a great deal of thoughts about my work and that of SEPAD more broadly. And I guess at this point I should plug a conference that we're having in Lancaster that Anna and Olivia are involved in organizing, which is going to be in April. Oh, and AK as well. Sorry. You've moved. You were formerly sat down there. Which is taking place in Lancaster in April on the 16th and 17th. We can send round a call for papers, but the theme of the conference relates directly to what we've been talking about here, reflecting on sectarian identities, desectarianization, and all things Middle East, generally speaking. So we'll send around the call, and it would be wonderful to see some of you in Lancaster in the spring. It will probably not be as warm as this, but you can't have everything. So if you're interested, talk to Anna, Olivia, or AK about it. Right, so what I'm going to do in my lecture is talk a little bit about a combination of 2 pieces of research. One is my forthcoming book, Houses Built on Sand, which is going to be coming out in about 3 weeks' time, I think. And another is a piece that came out at the end of last year in Middle East Law and Governance called Sectarian Games, Sovereign Power, War Machines, and Regional Order in the Middle East. And what I will do in the time I have today is talk a little bit about a different approach to sectarianism debates. So Morten did a wonderful job, as he always does, of outlining the key positions, the key debates within sectarianism literature. But then I think that what I and some others are doing are using some approaches from political theory to try and explain the ways in which life is regulated and the ways in which sects, along with other groups, are being caught up within sovereign power. And so that's going to involve a little bit of a reflection on sovereign power, a reflection on a spatial approach, which I talked a bit about yesterday, so I probably won't spend too much time on, and then look at it in the case of Bahrain. And I've got some holiday photos from Bahrain, which will probably resonate with many of you, but I think it might be quite interesting to see how some of these ideas actually work in practice. So, do we have any joy? No. Okay. So we know that traditional approaches to sectarianism, primordialism, instrumentalism, constructivism, etc., etc., etc. But as Rogers Brubaker says, we're all constructivists now, so perhaps that's where the debate is. What type of constructivist are we, and what does that look like? But what I'm thinking is that within those debates about us all being constructivists, it's interesting and important to reflect on how identities are regulated within those constructivist processes. So how identities are regulated, how life is regulated, and what it is that the state is doing to capture these identities, and conversely, what these identities are doing to try and operate within the context of the state, to push the boundaries of the state, and recently in Iraq and Lebanon, to thoroughly try and transform the state. And this is, it's fundamentally a political question about the way in which life is regulated and the way in which individuals are caught up in these projects, the way in which individuals are caught up within processes of sovereign power. Now, I should stress at this point that there is nothing that is inherently exclusionary about this in terms of sectarianism. It doesn't solely apply to sect-based politics, but it can be applied to other identity groups, it can be applied to ideological groups, it can be applied to ethnicities, and if we look across the recent history of the Middle East, and indeed beyond, we'll see that some of these questions have been applied to a range of different groups, tribal, ethnic, religious, and it's not just relating to sects. Okay? And if that's the case, then what we're dealing with is questions about power, questions about the regulation of life, and the arenas in which this contestation plays out. So when I was starting with my book, I started by asking the question, why did some Arab states fall while others didn't? Why was it that the Arab uprisings affected some dramatically and others not? And that led me down a bit of a rabbit hole in terms of reflecting on the nature of states. Oh, it's displayed here. Okay. Ah, okay, here. Nope. Okay, so it's working randomly. Sporadically. So here's my front slide. For now. Expelliarmus. No. Okay, never mind. You know what, forget it. So I started looking at states and the role of states. Then I realized that is a whole other set of debates. There's a vast literature on statehood. So I thought that one of the commonalities in terms of all these different states, identities, etc., is this focus on order and survival and the regulation of life. And here, I mean, this applies across the board. The idea that it's essential to regulate life and address the different challenges. Okay, so here the article, references, and the wonderful design of the front cover of the book, which Manchester University Press deserve a great deal of credit for. I think that's great. Okay, so here's the et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where we are right now. So the state is a site of contestation, post-79, post-2003, post-2011, etc. There are competing visions of the ordering of life, and what the state is trying to do, what regimes are trying to do in particular, is regulate life, to try and ensure that these competing visions, contending visions of ordering, be they political, ideological, ethnic, tribal, sectarian, don't offer a more compelling competing vision of order, okay? So what we start to see, along with the manipulation of a range of different aspects of life, is the manipulation of sectarian identities. Hence, the sectarianization thesis, which focuses on authoritarianism and the manipulation, an instrumentalist reading of sectarianism. But implicit within that is a focus on power, sovereign power, and it raises questions fundamentally about the ordering of life. And so that led me down this line of looking at sovereign power. And I apologize to those, Anna, Olivia, AK, and Morton, who've heard parts of this before, I guess. It led me down this route of looking at the work of an Italian philosopher, Giorgio Agamben, whose work focuses on sovereign power and not the state. And as a consequence, I find it particularly compelling. And that he's concerned with the regulation of life. He's not concerned with states per se. He's not concerned with political projects. He's concerned with the way in which regimes or sovereigns regulate life. He builds on the work of Michel Foucault. He tries to complete Foucault's biopolitical project. And what this does is that it helps me to circumvent some of the definitional problems about statehood, and it helps us to look at how life is regulated. Now, Agamben's work is dense, philosophical, rich, complex, frustrating. I had hair when I first read Agamben, and obviously I don't anymore. But it's wonderful and empowering and fascinating and provocative. And I'll just give you one quick quote from Agamben, who says that the real problem, the central mystery of politics, is not sovereignty but government. It is not the law but the police. That is to say, the governmental machine that they form and support. And across 9 different books, Agamben sets out this rich, complex thesis on sovereign power and the way in which life is regulated. And he does it through this sovereign decision to declare a state of emergency in an attempt to preserve the law. And this ability to declare a state of emergency is typically bound up in constitutions. So all constitutions will have this ability to suspend the law in a time of crisis to facilitate a quicker, more efficient form of government. But what happens for Agamben is that this state of exception, this state of emergency, tends to become the norm. It tends to become the most common form of government. Now, later in his work, he talks about a non-formal manifestation of this, that it's not just about the formal declaration of a state of emergency, but also this increasing predilection with security. Now, I'm not going to go too much into his theoretical work because I don't have a whole lecture series. I have about 20 minutes, and I want to talk a little bit about a particular case study. But I guess with Agamben, what it does is it aids efforts to understand the way in which sectarian identities are positioned within political organization across the Middle East, helping us to move beyond what Fanar Haddad termed the stultifying binaries that dominate the literature. Okay? And this is really important. We need to move beyond this traditional debate that Morton set out on the second day, I think, which seems like a long time ago now. And my way of doing that, my beyond the beyond, my savior, if you will, is Agamben. And he's my savior because he allows us to look at things in a slightly different way. He allows us to look at life and the way in which the sovereign regulates life more broadly. And here, what Agamben's work allows us to do, and if you're interested in knowing a bit more about how I use Agamben and what he does for the Middle East, then I'd suggest having a look at the article, or perhaps even the book, but that's not out yet, so maybe in the meantime the article. But what he does is it allows us to look at the role of regimes and sovereign elites in regulating life. It allows us to look at a range of different identities, a range of different groups. So people have deployed Agamben's work to look at urban politics, to look at refugees, to look at migrant workers. It allows us to focus on a range of different factors, but I'm using his work to focus on the way in which sectarian identities have been captured within the context of the state. Now, Agamben says that life is regulated through this inclusive exclusion. And by that he means that you are going to, if you're regulating a particular group, then you include them within the politics of the state by excluding them. So he draws on this ancient figure, a figure from ancient Rome called the Homo Sacer. And that is an individual who can be killed by anyone but not executed, but not sacrificed for ritualistic purposes. So that figure is bound by the laws of the state, but is not protected by them. Okay? And it's the same thing that applies more in more contemporary times. The idea that these groups that we're interested in are bound by the laws of the state, but they're not necessarily protected by them. So the refugee is bound by the laws of the state in which they're residing, but they're not necessarily protected from a range of other forces. Okay? So again, I'm skipping over a lot of the theoretical stuff. But I want to get onto the case of Bahrain because then hopefully it'll come to life a little bit more. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at the way in which life is regulated, the way in which sovereign and elites regulate life, but we're doing that within space. So while politics is inherently about people, space is the theater in which these actions and interactions take place. It's simultaneously a physical environment, a semiotic abstraction, and a relational space. Okay? All of this takes place within power relations. All of this takes place within particular temporal contexts. And it's shaped by a range of factors. Yesterday I talked about Doreen Massey's work, which suggests that space is shaped through the interaction of the intimately tiny and the hegemonic. And that's the same thing here. So sovereign efforts to regulate life regulate space, which is also shaped by a range of other particular contexts. So hopefully the Bahraini case will help shed some light on all of this, because I realize it's a bit complex and it's a bit theoretical for first thing in the morning, perhaps. But I think Bahrain offers a really interesting way of looking at this. It's a devastating story of the way in which sovereign power includes through exclusion, and the way in which sovereign power decimates life. So in the spring of 2011, Bahrainis, like many others, took to the streets of Manama and expressed their widespread frustration at the political rule of the Al Khalifa. They'd long been subjected to persecution, they'd been subjected to widespread political, social, economic repression, and while they'd been promised political reforms at a number of different points, these reforms hadn't happened. And so when there was this wave of protest across the region starting in late 2010, it wasn't all that surprising that the Bahrainis took to the streets chanting "Not Sunni, not Shia, just Bahraini." And so this was a photograph taken from Manama in 2011, and if you look carefully, you might even be able to see Toby Mathiasen. He's in the bottom right-hand corner. And so Bahrainis took to the streets on February the 14th. And this caused a serious existential crisis for the Al Khalifa, thinking about how on earth they were going to survive this crisis. They'd seen what happened in Egypt. They'd seen what had happened elsewhere. And let's not forget the demographic context of Bahrain here. Population then of around 1.2 million, only around 600,000 of whom were Bahraini nationals, split roughly 60-40, although some of those estimates range 75-25 in favor of a Shia majority ruled by a Sunni minority. So when people were taking to the streets, there was a great deal of concern amongst the Al Khalifa. And so on the 15th of March 2011, a state of emergency was declared. Security became a central concern. Security became paramount, and it allowed the regime to do whatever it felt was necessary in pursuit of their vision of survival. And so what happened very quickly after that was a GCC force crossed the causeway between the eastern province of Saudi and Bahrain and helped to crush the uprisings. And so this state of emergency was ended on the 15th of June after 3 months. But it was ended in name alone. All the other factors within this state of emergency remained. And what we quickly see is security becoming a paramount concern and a range of different tactics being used by the state in order to ensure its survival. And I've listed a couple of them here. So we see the sectarianization of political, social, economic, cultural, and religious life. We see the securitization of Shia groups. We see the securitization of politicians. We see citizenship stripping. We see the banning of political parties. Later, we see the securitization of Islamist groups, of journalists, of academics, of a range of other groups who posed a challenge to the survival of the Al-Khalifa. Essentially, what we saw here was the evisceration of dissent. Anyone who opposed the regime was destroyed. Now, this included the formal political opposition group Al-Wafaq, a number of whose key officials were stripped of their citizenship, now reside in London. They were visiting Parliament, the British Parliament, in 2012 to speak about the case of Bahrain. They were telling British parliamentarians what was happening in Bahrain. They got back to their hotel rooms, they put on Al Jazeera Arabic, and they found out that they were the headline story, that they had lost their citizenship. They were not alone. By the end of 2019, 738 Bahrainis have been stripped of their citizenship, which, if you think about it in terms of the small number of Bahraini nationals, is a huge number. Now, this infringes on a number of different aspects of international law, creating stateless persons. It's also an incredibly powerful and devastating thing to do to one's family, but it's a tool of sovereign power. It has implications for not only those who have lost their citizenship, but it also serves as a deterrent. Others were jailed. Doctors and nurses were imprisoned for helping treat Shia protesters. And the Bassiouni Commission Independent Inquiry, the BICI report, detailed the extent to which this had taken place. There was widespread discrimination. Shia lost their jobs. Doctors and nurses were put in prison for treating these protesters, for maintaining their obligations to the Hippocratic Oath. It was a devastating time. And what the regime was trying to do here is to ensure that there wasn't this coalescing of Sunni and Shia. They wanted to maintain their survival through framing the protesters as Shia who were being manipulated by Iranians. And if you talk to people, to British officials, to American officials at this time, they would say, look, the nefarious hand of Iran is behind everything. And it's interesting to trace those official lines going back to 2011. Coming out of the White House and coming out of 10 Downing Street, there was initial support for the protesters. And then very quickly it starts to disperse. You see that that prime ministers, presidents, world leaders spoke out in support of pro-democracy protesters, but then very quickly take up this line that it was about Iran preventing Iranian expansionism, preventing the fall of the Al-Khalifa regime. Now, let's not forget that Britain has a nice new shiny naval base in Bahrain for standing by the Al-Khalifa. The United States Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. So here we've got that interaction of local aspects with broader regional and international dimensions that we were talking about yesterday. And we're seeing the evisceration of academic work on Bahrain. We're seeing the evisceration of journalistic work on Bahrain. I'm no longer allowed to go to Bahrain. Many of my colleagues are no longer allowed to go to Bahrain. Many of my friends, Bahraini friends, have been arrested, have spent time in prison, and have been tortured, all for disagreeing with the state of Bahrain. Bless you. So it's a devastating story about how sovereign power has regulated life. And I want to just tell you the story of this woman here, Aman Salehi. And she, I think, is the quintessential example of this figure of, bless you, of the homo sacer. That's okay. So you remember the figure from ancient Rome, the one that could be killed but not sacrificed, and they could be killed with impunity. Now, Iman Salehi was a journalist, a sports journalist in Bahrain, and she was killed. She was shot dead by a member of the ruling family. This member of the Al Khalifa turned himself in. He was then released. There was no charge. Here you have the sovereign who is able to do whatever he wishes, free of charge, without any repercussions. Very quickly, after GCC forces went into Bahrain, they embarked on a process of herbicide. They destroyed the Pearl Monument and Pearl Roundabout because it was seen to offer a symbol of dissent, a symbol of opposition to the regime. This is sovereign power trying to regulate space. It was a way in which protesters could coalesce. It was seen to be a site of opposition. Even though it was a site of heritage, a site of cultural heritage, it was seen to be a site of opposition to the state. And so it was destroyed. Now, some scholars have termed this herbicide, the destruction of urban infrastructure, as a means of regulating life. And there's a lot of work that's been done on this, particularly in the Palestinian territories and Israeli military action in Jenin and elsewhere. But it's not just about this physical stuff. There's also an economic dimension, the way in which members of the Al Khalifa, supported by Sunni elites, but not exclusively Sunni elites, but also by some wealthy Shia groups, which is quite interesting in the sense that it's not just about sects. And this is where I think it's important that we bring in Agamben, because it allows us to look at the way in which life is regulated, not purely in terms of sects, but more broadly in terms of particular groups and power. And if you look at the back of this is the photo taken in the souk in Manama. And it's a traditional Gulfi souk, but at the back of it you can see some rather tall buildings. And those tall buildings are the financial harbour. They are owned by the Prime Minister. This is land reclaimed from the sea, prime real estate in Manama. Anyone care to guess how much the Prime Minister paid for this land?
Nothing.
He didn't pay nothing, he had to pay something.
Okay, they
Sorry?
there are areas which are government officials took
Yeah.
and built on and sold the housing and they paid nothing.
Okay, well,
And there are
in this
no
case, he paid $1, or the equivalent of $1. It's worth a huge amount of money now. And this was one of the key sources of frustration, but it was one of the ways that life is regulated here. Economic power and corruption was one of the key driving forces of the protests and a key source of frustration amongst many. But as well as the focus on individuals, there was also an attempt to regulate space across Manama. And here you have one of the main highways. I forget the name, I apologize. But on the left is the Ministry of Interior. Here you have a key intersection. You have, on the left of the photo, you have some armed policemen. In 2011, they would be armed soldiers, but when this was taken in 2014, they are armed policemen. But more interestingly, I think, are the photographs. The photos that are common the photos that are common in across Manama. This sense that it's inescapable to avoid the notion that you are in an Al Khalifa state. And here we see this visible manifestation of sovereign power. We see this visible sovereign presence across the state. Now, it may be that you think it's just a picture. And it is. It's just a picture. But it has more serious repercussions than that, because it is a visible reminder of sovereign power. It's a visible reminder that you are in a particular state, that you must obey the laws of that state. That if you don't obey the laws of that state, then you know what the repercussions will be, because you've seen them. You've seen the herbicide. You've heard about the citizenship stripping. You've heard about those people that have been arrested, tortured, detained. You've heard about those people who no longer are allowed to live here. You've heard about the people who've been killed. It's a visible reminder of sovereign power. And this type of regulation occurs across the state. I'm not saying it's unique to Bahrain, but in this case, this is what we're dealing with. And it's not just on this one highway. I mean, you can make out photos in the distance, you go across the souk, and you have other examples. But in certain places, there are acts of resistance. And at certain times, there are examples whereby sovereign power is being contested by incredibly brave young people who are trying to challenge state power. And what we see on this wall here, we see a range of different competing narratives. We see the photographs of those who've been killed. We see graffiti over the top of them. We see graffiti in Arabic and in English. Here we see an example of trying to speak to different audiences, the idea of trying to speak to the local Bahraini population in Arabic, but also to international journalists and academics. Bear in mind the Grand Prix race took place there, so they're trying to draw attention to the plight of Bahrainis. So again, it's that international dimension. But then you see people graffitiing over the top of it, at which point people will graffiti over the top of that, and it's this constant battle, this constant set of competing narratives and efforts to express a form of resistance to that sovereign power. I mean, it's a very small thing, graffitiing on a wall. But when you're facing such extreme forms of power and sovereign power, then that small act of everyday resistance, I think, is very, very powerful. And it can inspire others to do similar types of things. It's what James C. Scott has termed everyday resistance, and Asaf Bayat has talked about it in the Arab context as well. But I'll close my remarks here with a question of whether desectarianization. And I think the Bahraini case is an incredibly depressing one, in that there seems to be very little scope for dissent, very little scope for protesters to take to the streets and try and challenge the status quo right now, try and challenge the way in which life is regulated in the sense of what we're seeing in Iraq and Lebanon. And that, I think, is a consequence of the way in which sovereign power has operated, the way in which the Al Khalifa regime, supported by incredibly strong international actors, has managed to solidify its power and has managed to solidify its position vis-à-vis other groups who might be seeking to challenge it. Traditionally, you would have had protests from political groups, from leftist organizations, from trade unions, from sectarian communities. But they've all been decimated. They've all been destroyed. Leaders arrested, imprisoned, killed, deported. So it's incredibly hard to see any type of opposition to the state. And the state has created this sort of turbo nationalism, pitted against the Iranians, pitted against the outside, the Shia Iranians, closing off the inside, the Bahraini state, the Sunni Bahraini state against that outside. So it's incredibly hard to see any serious agency within that these days. And that photo, this photo here was taken 6 years ago now. So I think it's incredibly difficult to see that type of thing, that type of everyday resistance anymore, because of the way in which life has been regulated. So it's quite a depressing story, but I think what it does do is show the way in which using someone like Agamben, using this concept of sovereign power, helps us to understand how life can be regulated and how particular groups can be targeted, framed as particular threats, regulated, and decimated. I think that's where I'll leave it. So thank you very much.